suburban eastern Australia, an environment that has, over time, evolved some extraordinarily unique groups of Homo sapiens. But today, we observe a small tribe akin to a group of meerkats that gather together atop a small mound to watch, question, and discuss the current events of their city, their country, and their world at large. Let's listen keenly and observe this group fondly known as the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Hello and welcome back, dear listener. This is the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove podcast, episode 430. We might have a few new people watching or listening to the podcast. So a bit of a brief explanation. Normally it's a panel discussion with myself and two friends, Scott and Joe, where we talk about news and politics and sex and religion. This one's a bit different because on this occasion I've got Max and Oscar from the Socialist Equality Party, and they're going to be talking about Comrade Bogdan Syrotiuk, who is being held in a Ukrainian jail, and we're going to be talking about all sorts of other stuff. So first of all, Max, welcome aboard to the podcast.
Thank you, Trevor. Thanks for having us.
And Oscar as well. Welcome aboard.
G'day, Trevor. Thanks.
Yep. So Max and Oscar were on the podcast in the lead up to the previous federal election and gave their pitch for the Socialist Equality Party. Look that one up. It's somewhere there in the archives. And so anyway, Max reached out to me and asked to come on board and talk about what's happened with Bogdan Syrotiuk and to inform people of that. So I don't know, Max, I'm happy just to be freewheeling. Did you want to quickly tell people where you're from and then launch into what's happening in the Ukraine, just for people who are totally unfamiliar with the Socialist Equality Party and the two of you?
Yeah. So my name's Max Boddy. I'm a member of the Socialist Equality Party. I'm based in Sydney in New South Wales. And we're here today to discuss, as Trevor indicated at the beginning, the arrest of our comrade Bogdan Syrotiuk, who's a 25-year-old leader of the young guard of Bolshevik Leninists who operate both in Ukraine, Russia, and across the kind of former USSR. And as Trevor said at the beginning, he was arrested on April 25th by the notorious State Security Service of the fascistic Zelensky regime in the Ukraine. I think his arrest and imprisonment is nothing short of a complete political frame-up. Bogdan, as with the YGBL, which is the Young Guard of Bolshevik Leninists, their basic program is that of opposition to the US NATO-led war against Russia in the Ukraine, and calls for, in opposition to this war, the unification of the Ukrainian, Russian, and world working class on a socialist basis. And if I can be permitted to quote from what the SBU is charging him with, they say that, and he's being charged, I should add, with high treason, which carries a prison sentence of 15 years, which in Ukraine is essentially a death sentence. And the basis of this charge is as follows, that over the past 2 years, he has, quote, been engaged in the preparation and publications commissioned by representatives of a Russian propaganda and information agency, the World Socialist website. Now, the record of the World Socialist website, which is the publication of our party, will show that it is a fundamental political fact of our opposition to the Putin regime and the oligarchs that he represents. And so this frame-up is when it's removed in that sense of the lies, of the obfuscations that is put forward, what Bogdan's crime is essentially a thought crime, that he is putting forward ideas that the Zelensky regime oppose because it opposes their reactionary war. And ultimately,
So he essentially is opposing the Ukrainian government position as well as opposing the Putin and Russian invasion. So he's opposing both of those, and they're focusing on the opposition to, well, they're saying he's a mouthpiece for the Russian government in what he's been publishing on the Socialist website.
That's right. And it should be noted that the young guard of Bolshevik Leninists is an adherent of the International Committee of the Fourth International, of which, that's our party. We're the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International.
Yes. So would that group ordinarily be aligned with a group like Russians and or Putin's Russia, for example? Is the International Committee of the Fourth International? Is that right? Yeah. Ideologically, do you have much in common with Putin's Russia?
Not at all. I mean, the ICFI has opposed the Putin regime from its very inception. I mean, we draw out the history of the origins of the Putin oligarchy. I mean, its emergence was following the final betrayal of the Stalinist bureaucracy, which liquidated the Soviet Union in 1991, essentially stole the various assets, state-run assets, handed it over to these oligarchs that now Putin represents, and have, existed over a society of massive inequality as a result. And we oppose both the Putin regime and the Stalinist bureaucracy that they trace their origins to, because we are Trotskyists.
So ideologically, your group, including Bogdan, are all for the workers and for social equality, and you would view Russia's Putin as an oligarchic capitalist type organisation. Well, last things that you would care to sort of promote, and I guess that's. And I was reading, dear listener, there will be a link in the show notes to a PDF, which is the sort of the text that you've written, Max, and maybe with Oscar as well, but which gives all the details of your full spiel. So, from memory, the sort of indictment that has been made against him looks at one of the articles and basically looks at the points where he criticises Ukraine, but ignores the parts where he criticises Russia, and then just deemed him to be a Russian asset and a spy and a propaganda outlet for them. Why? What's the motivation of the actors here? If it's so clear that they've picked and chosen excerpts that suit them and ignored the excerpts that don't, what's the rationale here, Max? Why? Who's doing it and why?
Well, the Zelensky, the rationale is that the Ukrainian regime is more and more being, in that sense, hated and seen in a negative light by the population of the Ukraine, above all the working class. I mean, if you look at the timing of Bogdan's arrest, it occurred at the same time that the Ukraine passed a bill, mobilization bill, to effectively increase the number of people that are forced into the front line of this war against Russia. While statistics, particularly from Ukraine, are never accurate and don't tell you the number of dead, there are, by most accounts, at least 500,000 Ukrainians who have already died in this war. Maybe your listeners have seen some of the images on Twitter, amongst social media, of the barbarity of this war. And this war, which is really being led by Washington and the European NATO powers, is one, as we said at the beginning, for the carve up of Russia. And so this mobilization bill was passed under conditions of forcing more young people to the slaughter. And at the same time, the program and perspective of our movement, of which the Young Guard adhere to, the calling for the unity of the Ukrainian and Russian working class against this war, is something that they are deeply fearful will win a hearing. The other aspect, and I'll just be quick on this part, and maybe Oscar can jump in. The other aspect is that nothing that the Zelensky regime does, it does in isolation, in the sense that it would have had to have had approval, really, in the highest echelons of Washington, for them to go ahead with this arrest. And one could add the German ruling class and others in NATO. And so under these conditions, I mean, it's the same process really that you're beginning to see in other countries. In the United States, you had the crackdown on the anti-genocide encampments across the universities that you see in the United States. There's encampments that have been set up in opposition to the genocide in Gaza. They've been under attack, including the moving of riot police against them. Such similar anti-democratic attacks are taking place internationally. So it was part of, in that sense, a broader crackdown on basic democratic rights, and certainly would have had approval in the kind of, as I said, the highest echelons. And the main concern, the key concern of Zelensky and the ruling class is that the program of perspective of our movement, that is for the unity of the working class on a socialist basis, and for the overthrow of capitalism, is winning a hearing and will continue to do so amongst workers and young people.
Is there any effective opposition in the Ukraine, or is a guy like Bogdan one of the sort of few opposition potential leaders that people could gather around if they were wanting to avoid this mobilisation bill or wanting to complain? Is he one of the few that might gather a crowd that could cause a problem for the government, or is there any other effective Ukrainian opposition?
There are others who oppose what's happening in the Zelensky regime. And in fact, there is an article on our website by Max, is it Goldab, who is part of, I'm just trying to find the name of the group, maybe Oscar can, here we are, the Union of Left Forces for a Socialist Party. And this group, Maxim Goldab, certainly have warned against what's occurring in the country and have deep concerns, and their leaders and various others are being arrested by the regime, and some, as Maxim went through in our May Day rally that we held this year in earlier May 5th, 2024, our time, which Bogdan was slated to speak at, and prior to his arrest, made clear that there are those who have been arrested and have perished in prison, under this kind of the regime of Zelensky and the attack on essentially all left-wing opposition to war.
Yeah, I'm conscious Oscar hasn't had a chance to chip in. Away you go, Oscar. Feel free to talk about whatever you like from what's the previous discussion or lead somewhere else.
Yeah, well, I think many of the main points have been made by Max. I mean, the point about the transparent falsehoods in the indictment of Bogdan is correct. I mean, there's a very glaring contradiction there, in that the indictment itself acknowledges that Bogdan's a socialist, he's an internationalist, but then it claims that he's somehow an agent of the capitalist Putin regime. And that's a contradiction that they don't resolve or explain, and that they can't, which is characteristic of all frame-ups. I mean, just to emphasize, I think Max said, I mean, the young guard of Bolshevik Leninists does operate in Russia as well as Ukraine. It opposes the Russian government from the socialist left, and it fights for the unity of Ukrainian and Russian workers against their respective governments and against this war. I think just one point, which may be striking in terms of this case, is what it reveals about Ukraine. I mean, for the past 2 years, we've been told, by governments, the media, that this is a plucky little democracy fighting for its sovereignty and the like. What this really reveals is that Ukraine is a police state. And when we say that, there's not a trace of exaggeration. I mean, the entire country is under martial law. The last election was held in 2019. The deadline for the next election has elapsed. So Zelensky is effectively a dictator. All of the major opposition parties, including the largest opposition party, was banned in 2022. So this is, a fascistic regime. And I think that raises the question of what this war is really about. And what we've been emphasizing is that this is not a regional war in Eastern Europe. It really is a proxy war between the US and NATO and Russia. And increasingly, not just a proxy war. I mean, we published a statement on the World Socialist website today raising the fact that the US has now given approval for American-supplied weaponry to be used by Ukraine against Russian territory. That is, you'll have long-range US bombs striking targets within Russia. The reason that the Biden administration hadn't done that previously is because Biden himself acknowledged this would lead to World War III. So we're raising that this is a very sharp issue, and the defense of Bogdan is a question not just for the Ukrainian working class, it's integral to the fight against imperialist war, the fight to defend democracy here and internationally.
Some people might think that we're being a bit harsh on Ukraine, and I just, we've been doing this podcast, dear listener, for nearly 9 years now, and it just amazes me how good guys become bad guys and bad guys become good guys. And this happens a lot with China. We might talk about China later on if we get time when we're really free rolling on different things. But, you know, at one point they were the good guys in that people like Tony Abbott organised a free trade agreement with them, and people like Julia Gillard was organising joint military exercises with China. And the Australian newspaper, you know, Murdoch, notoriously right-wing, was criticising anybody who criticised those events. And now, of course, China's the big bogeyman, and, you know, it's just Orwellian the way that we were always fighting with East Asia, then we were always fighting with Eurasia, and it flips and changes. And just on the Ukrainian one, back in 2021, it's just worthwhile remembering that Maris Payne, she must have been Home Affairs, or I'm not sure what minister she was at the time, but she cancelled a former soldier's passport because he was planning to fight with the notoriously neo-Nazi Azov battalion in the Ukraine. And this guy was intercepted by ASIO and unable to leave the country because it was considered it would be too dangerous for him to go and fight in the Ukraine and come back with that sort of knowledge. So our ASIO boss said at the time, our concern there is that the neo-Nazi, he didn't use the word neo-Nazi, but his concern was that of this soldier coming back to Australia battle-hardened with skills. And you know, people forget these sorts of changes in the perspectives that we've had of different, you know, where goodies become baddies and baddies become goodies. So yeah, if you think we've been a bit harsh on Ukraine, they've got some form according to the people who now support them the most. So you've got to work your way through all that. So over to you guys. What next would you like to sort of... Well, have either of you ever met either online? Bogdan, did you ever, in your international meetings, ever speak with him or deal with him at all?
Well, I haven't had the privilege of meeting him in person, but certainly he has spoken whilst he was unable to speak at this May Day rally due to his incarceration. He did speak at our May Day rally in 2023, and that can still be found on the website, his speech. And certainly you can still see some of his articles, but you know, that's where I've heard him speak before, and it was very powerful to have a socialist anti-war voice from the Ukraine under conditions in which, as Oscar said, I mean, this war is touted by many as the good war, for lack of a better term, in which, you know, this is the freedom for democratic Ukraine against the big bad Putin government. And as he outlined, not only does this have nothing to do with the freedom of the Ukrainian people, it is entirely bound up with the war aims of US imperialism and the NATO forces to part of their broader war plans to carve up Russia, and ultimately their goal is China. And I think the statement that was published today on the World Socialist website, which is really warning of these dangers, that this is, one of the real dangers that's occurring is that workers and young people aren't in fact aware of what NATO is preparing to unleash on the world's population. The fact, as Oscar said, that Biden in the past said that, the utilization of US missiles, long-range missiles, from Ukraine into Russia would be World War III. The fact that that's been approved means that the calculations in US ruling circles is that such a war, such a World War III, so to speak, is something that's completely acceptable. And it's premised on the completely reckless idea that Putin and the oligarchs won't retaliate or draw their own conclusions to utilize, tactical nuclear weapons as a way of, again, to try and prevent the dismemberment from occurring. But really, when you look at it, and one of the points our statement makes, because it doesn't hold muster, this conception that Putin won't retaliate, really the calculations must be being made by the ruling elite in the US, as they've done virtually with every war throughout its entire existence, is a casus belli for full-scale war with Russia. Prod Putin into retaliating again, and so they can escalate the war.
I think the only calculation is how many bombs can they sell? The military complex, isn't it? That's the main calculation.
Certainly, look, there's no question that that capital is the interest, but they do. It's in that sense, it's not simply just weapons, but also geostrategic interests, spheres of influence, and ultimately they see all these strategic resources in Russia. Which does have, it's a vast landmass with huge amounts of raw material, including raw material that can be utilized for computer chips that today are absolutely vital for virtually everything within society. And they see that as something that they can carve up and control, but ultimately as a stepping stone to their broader war drive against China, which they see as their chief economic rival.
Yep. So if Bogdan was against what the Zelensky government was doing, and he was also against the Putin regime and its invasion, what do you guys say Putin should have done if not what he did? Like, should he have just sat on the sidelines and let everything happen?
Maybe, yeah, I can make a couple of points about that. I mean, we're not in the business of giving advice to Putin or any other capitalist government. And I think one of the points we've really sought to emphasize in analysing this war and its development is the necessity of placing it in a broader historical context. I mean, one aspect of the media sort of propaganda is that this all began in February 2022. Putin invaded out of the blue. It was completely unprovoked and the like. That's false. I mean, this is a development that goes back decades. And a key turning point was the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. That was the final betrayal of Stalinism. The Stalinist bureaucrats ended nationalized property, ended the social gains that remained, and they transformed themselves into oligarchs. Recall it, at the time this was presented as a path to peace, prosperity, democracy, and everything else. The complete opposite occurred in Eastern Europe throughout the former Soviet Union. A social catastrophe for the masses, the emergence of kleptocratic regimes, oligarchies, and also the promotion of national divisions. But the other thing that occurred was that you had a discussion within US strategic circles that this was now a unipolar moment. And we know what followed, really, 30 years of unending wars, initially targeting places such as the Middle East, Afghanistan, and the like. But I think what's really emerged, if you tried to date it maybe over the past 15 years or so, is the development of those regional conflicts into a much broader conflagration. And the US, and it's become very explicit, I think 2019, the Pentagon said, terrorism is not the issue anymore, it's great power conflict, and our chief rivals are Russia and China. So they have a whole perspective that underlies their actions, which is, as Max said, to dominate the Eurasian landmass, to prevent the emergence of any rival. And that's a program which means nuclear world war. The Putin regime has no progressive response to that because it does represent a capitalist oligarchy. To the extent that it advances any policy, on the one hand, it's sort of pleading for imperialism to come to the table to do a deal. On the other, it's saber rattling and the promotion of retrograde Russian nationalism. So that's one of the, really central points that the YGBL and comrades like Bogdan have been raising. I mean, there's no solution within the national framework. There's no solution orienting to any of these regimes. I mean, the question is returning to the perspective that animated the 1917 October Russian Revolution, uniting workers throughout the region to take political power, end capitalism, and begin the socialist reorganization of society. Because as was the case then, I mean, the alternative is massive war.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to push back a little bit because you say you're not in the business of telling Putin what he can and can't do, but you guys are in the business of criticising what he did. And one argument that you read is that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that bringing Ukraine into NATO was acknowledged by dozens of really well-respected Western analysts from Henry Kissinger down, including US ambassadors and various political scientists and advisors, really, really well-qualified people who said that would be a crazy thing for the West to do, would be to have the Ukraine in NATO. You need to have a neutral territory separating NATO and Russia, and they will understandably see this as a red line, just as America would if China put missiles in Mexico, or as America did when Russia was proposing to put missiles in Cuba. So with the idea that, okay, you may hate the way that the Russian society is organised and Putin is in control in what he does, but you still might take the view, well, okay, I don't like that regime, but for the sake of world peace, we need a neutral zone between NATO and Russia. And I still ask the question, if you criticise and say Putin shouldn't have done it, what should have happened? And to say that the workers should have risen up and conducted a revolt just isn't possible. So I just wonder what should have happened. I know you might say there's no solution, which would be fine, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, and look, I mean, perhaps I should have said, I mean, the other element of, the past 15 years is, or really, the past 30 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is the relentless eastward expansion of NATO. Of course, in Ukraine, there was a coup in 2014, financed by the US, Germany, involving fascistic forces. They ousted a democratically elected government that had oriented to Russia. So, yeah, I mean, this is a war that's been instigated by NATO. They bear primary responsibility. But in that sense, Putin fell into their trap. And his whole conception, which has now been made public, was that you'd have a short special military operation invasion, and that would compel Ukraine and the US to the negotiating table. Russia could achieve concessions and the like. None of that's occurred because the program of American imperialism is for ultimately the complete subjugation of Russia, regime change in Moscow and the like. I mean, the point about Putin's response is, I mean, this is a war that has claimed untold lives, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives on the Russian and Ukrainian sides alike. NATO, again, bears primary responsibility, but Putin also shares his responsibility for that. And the whole perspective now of, the Russian government, what do? I mean, if they respond to the US provocations with military means, as is highly likely, you're talking about a nuclear world war. So we certainly think the perspective of the working class taking power is realistic because it's necessary. The alternative is catastrophe on a global scale, which would make the horrors of World War I and World War II pale into insignificance. And I think what we're really trying to emphasize is that these are not just government policies. I mean, they do stem from a global capitalist system that's in a profound crisis, deepest crisis since the 1930s. And governments really see no way out except through a program of war abroad. We know where that leads. The alternative has to be developed, fought for, an independent movement of the working class, and we raise that means building our party on a global scale.
The sort of workers' revolution that you guys are hopeful for and working towards, the chances of that has increased a little bit in recent times, I think, because of the tragedy in Gaza. And I'm happy to sort of bring that topic in at this moment because I think that tragedy is so obvious to people and they can look at it and recognise that there are the good guys in the West who are conducting this terrible catastrophe, and they are using weasel words and all sorts of propaganda to try and justify it. And I think that's enough for people to suddenly go, hang on a minute, are we the baddies? Is the system wrong? And maybe with Ukraine before, they weren't really sure, were there really Nazis in the Ukrainian system? Putin's evil, of course. Probably the West is still in the right, blah, blah, blah. But something like Gaza has, I think, led to a situation where a lot of people have really started to question what they've been told. And once the sort of the curtain is lifted and it's revealed to people the truth of what's going on in Western sort of deception, then suddenly all sorts of things will become open to people's eyes, and they'll see it everywhere, if you like. They'll see it in Ukraine, and they'll see it in China, and they'll see it in other areas. So I think, as tragic as Gaza is, I think it is an event that is so plain and clear to people that your chances of communicating what is going on might have increased a little bit.
I think that's correct, Trevor. I mean, the genocide in Gaza has had a profound impact on the consciousness of millions of workers and young people around the world. You've seen, protests that have erupted at numbers that, haven't existed in decades and decades and decades, and even in some ways pale in comparison to anti-war movements of the past, including even the question of Vietnam, but certainly it pales, the kind of opposition to the Iraq war was a single day. You had millions on the street, but in this case, you have millions out, around the world, and sustained anti-war protests every week. I mean, it is significant that in this country in particular, you've got weekly protests that have occurred certainly in Melbourne and Sydney, but generally, in one form or another across the entire country. But that process isn't automatic. I think the Gaza genocide, as being seen as part of the global drive to war by the United States, including the ongoing war in the Ukraine, is not something that is immediately apparent. And part of the reason that isn't immediately apparent is that the very organisers of the protests, those around the, above all, what we call pseudo-left, fake socialists, those who espouse occasionally, although less and less now, socialist rhetoric, whilst, ultimately their orientation is towards the upper middle class. I mean, at the protests, they do not mention the larger question of the drive to war, ultimately because they support the war in Ukraine against Putin. Their position is so is in that sense in the opposite of that of Bogdan and the YGBL.
So are you saying at the anti-war protests regarding Gaza and Ukraine, there's virtually no mention of the US driving these events? Is that what you're saying?
Well, certainly the United States may be mentioned, although one has to say that the limitations of the protests as they continue in terms of the speeches, the actual broader context is in fact reduced further and further. I mean, look, we do go out to the protests and speak to those who are there. There's no question. I mean, there's many, we're not saying that those who attend the protests are the same as those who lead it. But those that lead it, their positions that they put forward are very much appealing to the very governments who are responsible for these crimes, which is a dead end. That doesn't work. I mean, over 6 months have proved that. What is required is a new political perspective, that of a socialist perspective, above all, a turn to the working class, which is the social force within society that can bring an end to this war. I mean, you have, as an example, just as one example, I mean, the massive, you've heard of, maybe it's discussed here, the Zim shipping line, which is a large international shipping line of Israel, which essentially, once the genocide began, gave over all their resources to Israel, and they've been loading and unloading in Australian docks since the war began. And the Maritime Union of Australia have allowed and have not called a single, nor has any union, the union bureaucracy has not called a single political strike. That is despite there being mass opposition amongst the working class. In other words, the unions, which operate in close collaboration with the pseudo-left, who put all backing behind the union and the union bureaucracy, are stifling, are in fact turning away workers from this revolutionary perspective. So look, I don't disagree that the question is that these developments are having a profound impact on consciousness, but that process isn't automatic and does require, above all, the intervention of a revolutionary party. And that is what is so worrying to Zelensky and Washington and the ruling class internationally, and is why Bogdan has to be arrested, or at least in their eyes was arrested and to be charged, because that perspective cuts right across their interests.
So why aren't these unions being politically active in the way that they used to be? So, for example, in the lead up to the Second World War, I think we were exporting pig iron to Japan, and tensions were high, and the union movement said, what are we doing? We're sending this pig iron to what looks like a future enemy who's going to make bombs and drop them on our boys. And Bob Menzies got the nickname Pig Iron Bob, and it was pressure from the union movement that stopped the export of pig iron. So what's changed? Why aren't union leaders as politically motivated? And for that matter, our current Labor government, who seems to be, I had low expectations, but boy, it's been pretty bad. They're closer to the Liberal Party than any other party. Why is it that the Labor Party broadly and then the union movement seems so right-wing on these issues?
I think, in terms of the union leaderships, they've always supported their own governments in periods of imperialist war, including, as you were just referencing, in the Second World War. They presented this as a war for democracy against Japan, which was a fraud. It was a war for dominance in the Pacific, which was ultimately established by American imperialism. Played a similar role in World War I. But I think even compared with those periods, there's been a qualitative degeneration of the trade unions. These are thoroughly corporatized entities today, and their foreign policy is very much bound up with their domestic policy. If you look at what the ACTU and the union movement have done over the past 40 decades, it's been ensure that there are no strikes, no action by workers as masses of jobs are being cut, wages are being cut in every single enterprise agreement. over recent years, along with conditions. And that's why, there's an immense social crisis today. In terms of the genocide, I mean, that complicity in this, including, as Max said, by facilitating, enabling the handling of Israeli goods by the Zim shipping line, which did dedicate its entire fleet to the war effort, Israeli war effort, in October. But that's because this is a pro-imperialist bureaucracy. It's allied with the Labor government, and it supports the war that we've been discussing against Russia in Ukraine. I think in terms of why Labor is supporting the genocide, it's connected to the point that Max was raising before. I mean, the dominant line that's put forward by the protest organisers, by various groups that we describe as the pseudo-left, is that the genocide is sort of an isolated episode, and that the way that it can be ended is through moral appeals and placing pressure on governments, including the Labor government, to change course. But what we've been trying to emphasise is that the genocide is one component of this developing world war. It's not disconnected from what the US is carrying out against Russia, against China. And that's a very direct connection. I mean, we've seen over recent months, Israeli attacks on Iranian territory, US strikes on Iranian-aligned Houthi forces in Yemen. The genocide is becoming one aspect of a broader conflagration throughout the Middle East, aimed at securing US and allied interests. And Australian imperialism in the form of the Labor government is completely committed to this. One sort of central aspect of that is that Labor is presiding over very dramatic militarisation of the country here, explicitly in preparation for conflict in the Indo-Pacific, that is for war with China. So, what we're trying to draw out is that these developments are linked, and, governments that will support genocide, which is what we're seeing in Gaza, will not stop short of using nuclear weapons, carrying out other horrors to advance their geostrategic interests under conditions of this crisis of world capitalism.
You guys are keen on organising the workers, and I intuitively think of the union movement as being critical to organising workers, but we're coming to a conclusion that the union movement's pretty broken and isn't going to do it. So there are other examples around the world of what are the examples where workers are able to organise without the union movement being heavily involved?
Well, what we call... Oh, sorry, Oscar, you go. I'll go after you. Sorry, I'll go and then you can speak, Oscar. Look, we fight for the formation of rank and file committees of workers. We've called for this formation, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, in which this virus was allowed to spread across the world without any of the necessary safety measures to prevent it. I mean, it was something that in massive areas of factories, particularly in the United States, but across the world, workers were forced into work under conditions in which they would get infected and most likely die or have lifelong health conditions. We called for the necessity of the formation of rank and file committees. This is something entirely within the tradition of the Trotskyist movement, to break with the union bureaucracy and establish their own organizations of struggle. Now, these rank and file committees have begun to be established in countries around the world, including in the United States, in Sri Lanka, and even in this country.
Would people think of them as unions? I mean, you're calling them committees, but are they kind of just like a rival union in in style and function? Are they that different to a union? Would one of these committees be that different? If it's sort of I gather it's based around where people work and gatherings from factories or, Amazon workplaces or something like that. What's the difference between one of these committees and a union?
Well, I think one has to be very clear of how a union operates. The unions now operate in the bureaucracy as essentially the industrial policemen of the working class. I mean, there is no democracy really in unions. We've experienced that when our rank and file committees attempt to put forward any resolution, any positions that in that sense doesn't line up with the position of the union bureaucracy, which is sellouts, which is the bringing in of a tax on working conditions. And whenever that's put forward, our rank and file members are shouted down, various anti-democratic measures are used to silence them. So they operate not in that sense in any way as democratic organisations or truly organisations of workers. And in fact, in the large part, workers aren't members of the unions anymore. There has been a vast shift in the amount of people actually and workers as part of unions. Young people in particular don't join them. They correctly see that they do nothing for their conditions. They see them as, generally as organisations that will take fees, but will in fact not improve anyone's conditions. And if you look at the most highly unionised areas within the country, particularly, for example, the nurses and healthcare workers, but in particular nurses, they've had their conditions deteriorate some of the most sharpest of all workers in the country. I mean, we just had an experience in Western Australia, in which you had Western Australian, the Australian Nurses and Midwives Federation were attempting to ram through another rotten deal under conditions in which nurses have had essentially a pay freeze for years and years and years, in which they're experiencing massive staff shortages. They refuse to distribute the material, distribute what this deal is that they negotiated with the government behind closed doors. They were quite easy to hand out pickets and shirts to the nurses, but never the actual agreement. They then presented in a series of slides that don't actually touch on the most fundamental things, which is conditions and pay. Slowly, the slides go further, and workers are beginning to question, well, what's happening for our conditions? And by the end, the deals that are offered are paltry, below inflation ultimately, and are going to do nothing to improve their conditions. There was mass hostility.
Have you seen in the UK with the railway union over there, Mick Lynch, and have you observed any of that union's activities at all?
Look, it doesn't quite come to mind. Maybe Oscar knows more than I on that.
Yeah, I mean, they've carried out limited industrial action. Understanding is that was wound up, and again, they've pushed through deals that are concessionary in nature. And if you look at the British union leadership, including Lynch, who sort of postures as a left, I mean, their whole line now is that you're going to have to support Keir Starmer in the forthcoming British general election under conditions where he's, indistinguishable from a Tory. He says one of his great idols is Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
If he was required to, he'd, use nuclear weapons. So, yeah, I would not put him forward.
Okay, I thought he might have made the cut as somebody who was an okay union leader, but not. My understanding is, for example, in Australia with the Shoppies Union, Shopkeepers and Distributed Allies Union, is one of the more powerful unions because of the numbers. There's obviously a lot of workers employed in Coles and Woolworths, etc. And that particular union is quite right-wing, and it then has an inordinate amount of power in factional deals in the Labor Party and wields a very pro-right-wing, very pro-religious Christian line as well. And the like Coles and Woolworths want that union in place because it doesn't really fight for the employees, so it makes it easier for them to stay in power. And I don't know, and it seems to me that that's then led to a very strong right-wing faction in the Labor Party, and someone like Richard Marles, our Defence Minister, is well and truly part of that, and has been subjected to so much American propaganda that he may as well be an American politician, I think, and just the good left elements of the Labor Party just don't have the numbers against that. So that's the sort of picture I've come to understand of the Australian Labor movement anyway. But sorry, I interrupted you before, Max, but I don't know. Workers' committees sound a lot like unions without the current union leaders and just trying to start afresh. But
no, a very different perspective as well. I mean,
Right.
we will fight to come to the head of the rank and file committees and put forward the perspective. I mean, we tell workers the truth. What they're up against is not just simply a bad boss, bad manager, bad CEO, or what have you, but not only the company as itself, but in that sense, the entire capitalist system. I think the other point that it's interesting what you raise. I mean, the Labor Party is nominally run by the Labor left at the moment. I mean, that's
it's very nominal though. I think
it-
Albanese is tied.
But what I'm saying is that, and if you want to know the death of or the final nail in the coffin of anything Labor left, is Jerry Hand in 1991 when he, on the floor of the Australian Parliament, proposed the mandatory detention. That was the Labor left's, their great contribution in 1991. But look,
Right.
Albanese and Wong and the whole lot of them. I mean, look, I think the key point to make, just to re-emphasise what Oscar said, I mean, it's not an aberration that they support the genocide. In fact, Labor has supported Israel since its inception in 1948. It's always been the party of Australian imperialism and in war. That's the party that's turned to in the ruling elite during World War I and World War II under conditions of mass opposition. They're brought in to dampen down, to turn away, to stop the developing movement of the working class. I mean, they're not a party in that sense of the left or for workers. They're a party, as I said, of the ruling elite in Australian imperialism, and have been, for its entire history.
Mm. So the future is workers' committees. Is that the way out of this mess? Is that what you're saying?
The future, yeah.
To organise the workers' movement is workers' committees.
Yeah, it's certainly one aspect of it. I mean, what we find, and we do conduct political work in the working class, there's huge anger about the cost of living crisis, the social crisis. As you said, there's opposition to war. The issue is that finds no outlet. It's suppressed, including by the trade unions and their leaderships. So the question is the working class taking matters into its own hands, and the formation of rank and file committees is one means for that to be done. We conceive of these as democratic bodies run by workers themselves, not bureaucrats on six-figure salaries, and their aim would be to unite workers across industries, between different industries, and to prosecute both an industrial and a political struggle for improved wages, conditions, and the like. And what we raise is that such a movement of the working class inevitably confronts major political issues, including the issues that we've been discussing this evening. There's not a brick wall between, the moves towards World War III and the struggles of workers for wages, conditions, and the like. In fact, question of who's going to pay for war, I mean, it is ordinary people, workers. You talk about $368 billion committed to nuclear-powered submarines. Where's that money going to come from? We know it's from education, healthcare, intensified exploitation in the workplace. So certainly we fight for rank and file committees as a means through which workers can advance their independent class interests. But above all, we're raising the need for a new political perspective, a socialist perspective, which unites workers internationally against the capitalist system itself.
if workers are going to fight for what's in their best interests, they have to know what's in their best interests. And sometimes that can be, if not counterintuitive, at least counter to the propaganda that they would have been subjected to for their entire lives. So I fear you could have a fully democratic workers' committee and people voting for things that would actually be counterproductive because they don't know what's the best solutions because they haven't understood these things. Like, I think, workers in the Rust Belt voted for Donald Trump thinking that he was going to fix things for them when it was the last person who was going to. So how do you overcome knowledge deficits and understanding of how things work? Because you guys are clearly anti-capitalist, but most people would be so indoctrinated to think that capitalism is the only possibility. And, I think, the opposite of what you're talking about is some sort of Soviet-style Gosplan where everything's regimented and we don't want that. So how do you go about educating and informing people about what might be in their best interests and how to figure it out? Because most people are really busy. They don't have time. Like, sort of what this podcast does is for busy people, give them an hour and a half each week where they can catch up on what they should know. And when they're sitting around and somebody speaks bullshit, they can say, no, I heard it on the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove. That's not how it works. It works like this. But, I just find an enormous amount of ignorance out there as to people will still believe in trickle-down economics. They'll still go, the rising tide lifts all boats. They'll still, come out with this shit. So they'll say there's too much regulation by the government, a whole range of things. So how do you overcome all that, or do we just wait for Rupert Murdoch to finally die and then that's when we get our chance?
The very process of the breakdown of capitalism is, as we actually were discussing earlier on the question of the genocide, is transforming consciousness on a mass scale. The process through that transformation will take different forms. One can't exactly predict how the breakdown will occur, but it is occurring. And many statistics, whenever polls are done on the question of capitalism, particularly young people, are in opposition to it. I mean, they oppose the system that they're in. They don't see it as having any future. The problem is, as is always the case, is that consciousness lags behind objective developments. There isn't, as we were discussing before, awareness really of the danger of nuclear war not being something in the distant future, but potentially coming very, very rapidly as a result of the role of US imperialism and its war aims across the entire Eurasian landmass. How is that overcome? Well, we fight for, firstly, the building of our party, the Socialist Equality Party. I mean, we are fighting to build a vanguard party of revolutionary workers who seek to bring forward this program and perspective into the working class. The rank and file committees is one form. The IYSSE, which is our youth arm, is another form. We're currently in the fight for 1,500 electoral members, which is a requirement to be put back on the ballot paper. We were deregistered as a political party in late 2021, as were a whole layer of other smaller parties, as a result of anti-democratic laws that were rammed through Parliament by the Liberal Party or coalition in close collaboration with Labor, and without really a boo from the Greens, one has to say. And so now we have a situation in which there's been a whole slew of smaller parties that have been deregistered. We're fighting for our re-registration, and we encourage any of your listeners who are interested in what we're saying to consider joining, and certainly to join our campaign.
Tell them where to go, Max. Give them the website name so they can go and sign up or whatever. Sure, go ahead.
So it's the wsws.org is our website. To join as an electoral member, you can go to sep.org.au/emjoin. I don't know if I can put it in the chat at some stage, might help. I don't know, but I could do
I'll
that
put a
later.
link. I'll put a link in the show notes, dear listener.
Yeah, and I really encourage your listeners as well to go onto our page on Bogdan, and the best way to do that is wsws.org/freebogdan. That's where you can find all the information about what we've been dealing with. But we use every means, Trevor, at our disposal to educate the working class through the World Socialist website, through, trying to stand in elections.
I'm sure you do. Believe me, I know how hard it is to break through. That's my point, I guess. Is it's difficult to break through. So
see, the process of the breakdown of capitalism moves people very, very rapidly. I think that's why I find, we haven't spoken in 2 years. What has happened in those 2 years? As we've had the massive disintegration of social and living conditions of workers, inflation through the roof, people can't live really, anymore. And so they will begin to seek alternatives. But what is critical is obviously the building of our movement in anticipation of mass revolutionary struggles. Workers will enter into revolutionary struggle with or without the Socialist Equality Party in existence. That's capitalism will create those conditions. But for that revolutionary struggle not to be either fizzle out or, more importantly, the counter-revolution to come in and smash it up, you need a Bolshevik-style revolutionary party that will lead the working class to power, and that's what we fight to build.
Right. Yep. I don't know, guys. I mean, that's taken us an hour. Do you want anything else that you wanted to get off your chest in particular, or I'm happy to wrap it up, and I'm happy to sort of keep going. It's entirely up to you. Were there other issues to do with? What's your view on China? I mean, in terms of, we're talking about how do we organise societies here, and you'd have to say that the amazing effort that's been done to pull so many people out of poverty has, in such a short period of time, has been quite astounding. But no doubt it's not perfect. So what's the Socialist Equality Party view of China and the Chinese Communist Party and how that society's organised? Good bits and bad bits. I'm curious.
Do you want to start us off, Oscar? You still there?
Might be on. Yeah, now we can hear you. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complex question. I mean, just one aspect on what you raised previously, I think, as Max was saying. I mean, workers are propelled into struggle by the conditions that they confront under capitalism. There is a deepening social crisis that will provoke major struggles here and internationally, and the escalation of war will be accompanied by an escalation of war against the working class. Just one point on the issue you raised about people in the Rust Belt voting for Trump. Many of them had voted for Bernie Sanders or supported him, and they swung behind Trump after Sanders wrapped up his 2016 candidacy and promoted Hillary Clinton. So one aspect, Sanders essentially and the Democratic Party helped hand the presidency to Trump on a platter. So one aspect of fighting for a socialist movement is exposing fake left charlatans such as Sanders, such as Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, who played a similar role. Another is, the clarification of the complex historical questions of the 20th century. Certainly the 1949 Chinese Revolution was a major advance in history. Definite gains were made, but we always insisted that it was deformed at birth. And the issue was that the Chinese Communist Party, a Stalinist organization, had essentially a nationalist perspective, conception that socialism could be built in one country. It can't be. It has to be an international system because we live in a global society, a global economy, and the working class itself is an international force. I mean, it's not possible to go through all of the twists and turns, but no one really views China as a socialist society, or a society on the path to socialism. I think it has the fastest growing number of billionaires in the world. And the issue is, I mean, it's very economic growth, which you referenced, has now brought it up against a sort of global war drive of American imperialism. And the Chinese regime has no answer, just as Putin has no solution. Again, on the one hand, it sort of appeals to, pleas to the imperialist powers for some sort of deal. On the other hand, it's, saber rattling the promotion of Chinese nationalism, which only serves to divide the working class and heighten the prospects of a catastrophic conflict. So certainly our perspective, again, is an international one for an international class. I mean, we say that Chinese workers have to unite with workers in the United States, in Australia, against all of the governments and against the profit system. And as we were discussing at the beginning, I think, in relation to Bogdan, I mean, we are the Trotskyist movement. So we are the movement that fought against the betrayals of Stalinism from the beginning, and defended, the perspective of world socialist revolution, which was what led the 1917 Russian Revolution, and what we think is now the path, the perspective that needs to be turned to under conditions today.
Max, anything to add to the China thoughts?
I think Oscar's characterised. I mean, there is no progressive solution that the Chinese regime has to this question of war. I mean, its response to the AUKUS military pact, that's the Australian, UK, US, pact, the building up of the Navy and essentially the transformation which the Labor Party is completing of Australia into essentially a launching platform for war against China, is to build up for war itself. It is I mean, the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, the name is misleading. It's not a communist country nor a socialist country, but a thoroughly capitalist country. So we call on the Chinese working class to break with their own ruling elite at home, as we do with workers around the world, and to unite internationally on a socialist foundation. So yeah, I mean, I think those points are important around the question of China. And one point I just want to emphasize, because in the course of the discussion, there can be a tendency, and if you want to talk about, how consciousness develops as well, it's very much in the kind of normal terms to say, our government, our country. Well, the reality is there are really two countries in every nation. The country of the ruling elite that run everything. This is the government of the ruling elite. This isn't our government. And then there's that of the working class. And what we seek to do is to unite the working class together against their own ruling class at home. As Lenin said, the main enemy is at home. It's not the working class brothers and sisters in that sense that, in First World War, they were being flung off to murder. And it's the same, interestingly, if you go to the question of Israel and Palestine. We call for the unity of the Palestinian and Israeli working class. That the Israeli working class, who themselves are, very oppressed. I mean, the Netanyahu regime brutalizes the workers and any opposition to the genocide. And we call for the Israeli and Palestinian working class to unite, against their, against the ruling elites at home, including the Palestinian Authority in Palestine, which, has done everything in that sense in its power to facilitate this genocide. Locks arms with Netanyahu and the Israeli regime. I mean, it offers no solution for the Palestinian working class. But anyway,
have you read or seen much of Yanis Varoufakis? Have you paid much attention to what he does?
Yeah, we've written a fair bit on Varoufakis at different stages, and Syriza itself, which in Greece was essentially the pseudo left in power. We talk about the pseudo left. They came to power in Greece. the promises of, on the back of the promising of ending the kind of massive austerity measures against the Greek working class. Well, what did they do? They continued and deepened it. You had a situation.
I think he's been quite effective, though, in demonstrating the power of, say, the German banks and that sort of oligarchy capitalist system that just does what it wants and bugger the rest of the community, sort of thing. I think he's been effective, at least in that level, in describing that. So more and more characters like that are what's needed to open people's eyes to how the world's actually working.
I think the thing about Varoufakis and the entire layer that he represents is the ultimate orientation that is put forward is that in some form to reform capitalism or to elect a government of various amalgamation of pseudo-left socialists that can somehow resolve the issue. I mean, the truth is the working class needs to be told the truth. I mean, when we say consciousness lags behind, workers need to be told the truth. It's not simply the question of electing a new government. You cannot reform capitalism. I mean, we're talking about socialism. Socialism is a very, very difficult task, there's no question, but reforming capitalism is impossible. And so the answer to that is, as I said, World Socialist Revolution. And I think someone's posted one of our articles. We have got numbers of articles on Varoufakis that we can discuss.
Okay, yeah, is the title of it, Yanis Varoufakis Tours Australia, a pseudo-left representative of European capitalism in search of political allies. That's the title of it?
Yep.
I'll have to read that one. And I think I'm a bit of a fanboy of Yanis, so I'll read that one with interest. Yep.
I think it is worth dwelling on what he actually did. Obviously, he gives lectures, he gives talks, but if you look at his actual political career, it was in the Syriza government, which came to power in January 2015. It did so on the basis of claiming that it would end austerity, it would advance the interests of Greek workers. It did the absolute opposite. I mean, what Varoufakis did as finance minister was impose the dictates of the very German and European banks, which he now claims
actually he resigned before that. So when
no. I mean, he was finance minister from January to July, and in that period, the Syriza government agreed to continue imposing cuts, which had been mandated by the previous government. He insisted that Greek workers had to sacrifice all the while. I mean, he is a multi-millionaire himself, a very affluent individual. And then, as you say, he did resign. He and the Syriza leadership organised a referendum in July. Do you agree with the continuation of austerity? Syriza thought the population would vote yes because they wouldn't see any way to oppose the cuts being demanded by the European banks. In fact, the population voted resoundingly no, and Varoufakis said in his memoir that the atmosphere within Syriza's leadership was dejection, despair, that the Greek masses had voted so overwhelmingly against austerity, and so that was
his fellow members, but not him himself. He was elated by it, but
he was the finance minister. And actually, sorry, just one other point which we do raise in the article, which someone linked, is he said, I mean, when he went into the discussions with the EU bankers, when he'd just become the finance minister, he subsequently raised what he proposed was standard Thatcherite and Reagan economics, that is austerity, which is what he carried out. And I think it's an important issue because, one of the questions that comes up is, there is actually mass hostility to the banks, the corporations, social inequality. And under those conditions, you do have figures such as Varoufakis, organisations like Syriza put forward to sort of trap that discontent and to divert it back behind the capitalist parliamentary establishment. And the whole argument, is that there's some way of reforming the situation, ameliorating inequality, which is proven, in practice to be a sham and a trap.
We, as we're talking here, we've got a chat room operating, and full marks to everybody who are writing their comments. They're coming thick and fast, and too much for us to sort of read and comprehend, I think. Gentlemen, if any of them were, you wanted to respond to, you can, but dear listener, you could watch this on YouTube or on Facebook, and you will see people's comments as well, some of them quite lengthy, and they've put some thought into it, obviously. So thank you to the people in the chat room for that. Apologies that we don't actually get through all this, because I would spend, for example, about a minute reading this current one and then another 2 or 3 minutes having to consider it, and there would be 3 minutes of dead air, and it's just, we can't do it. But thank you for your contributions. Anything else, gentlemen, or are you happy to sort of wrap it up? I'm happy for you guys to come back at another time in the future. Look, does just circling all the way back to Bogdan Syrotiuk, does he have legal representation? Does he have what?
Look, we are seeking to assist in all manner possible to get the best legal representation. As you might see, and your listeners will see if they have a look at the statement, part of the police state conditions within Ukraine is that we had to approach about 5 different lawyers, even for him to be able, which all of them rejected, because they feared, quite rightly, not only for their own careers but life. There is a real definite threat. If you're a lawyer and took this on, there was a fear that you would be forced into the army and thrown to the front lines, and it's not unreasonable. But we are, look, we are doing and going to assist in whatever means necessary, in whatever legal avenue possible, to free Bogdan. But the critical component will be this campaign. I mean, this campaign, and the international campaign and fight for his freedom will be really the critical and determining factor in the outcome for him.
So, what do you want people to do?
I'd love everyone who is listening to look at our website on this, wsws.org/freebogdan, and I think that was in the chat. It'll probably come up again. There's an option through that website to sign the petition, which I encourage everyone to do, but also send in statements of support. We're calling on the broadest, spread of this campaign. I mean, in that sense, we're not calling on people to have explicit political agreement with everything that we've discussed tonight. I mean, this is a socialist opponent of war who is being arrested for essentially a thought crime. It is the sharpest representation on the attack on all left-wing opposition. So in that sense, we're asking those to follow their own, not in that sense ours, but their own political perspective, their own political positions, and to oppose the political frame-up of Comrade Bogdan, as I said, a socialist and an opponent of war.
Just before we went live, I was talking to Max about a fellow called Kieran O'Reilly, who was part of the Catholic social workers movement. Dear listener, he is an Australian, and he was involved in damaging the B-52 bombers that were heading to Iraq at one point, and he spent time in American and Irish jails, and a very interesting character. And he's currently with a vigil outside Belmarsh, I think, supporting Julian Assange. If you're interested in looking at this podcast further and you're wanting a really cracker of an interview, episode 343, go and look that one up. It's an amazing story about a selfless man fighting for social justice. So my little ad for the extra listeners we've got with this episode is check out episode 343, Kieran O'Reilly. Very interesting. So, well, Max and Oscar, I reckon that's probably enough. If some development happens down the track of any significance, give us a shout out and we'll get you back on, or at least let people know something about it. So thanks for your time and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thanks very much, Trevor.
Thanks for having us on. Yep.
No worries. Okay. Bye, everybody. We'll be back next week. Normal episode. Scott and Joe and myself, we'll be talking about news and politics and sex and religion, all the things you're not supposed to talk about at a dinner party. So, alrighty.